Wants to, stick to his word. Back in September, you may recall that I said we're going to be starting a new series that's going to kind of carry us into Christmas. And it may have seemed at the time that perhaps I had bitten off more than I could chew, but we took big bites along the way. And essentially, we kind of took a bird's eye view of the Old Testament and had a better understanding of what is going on in the midst of the Bible to help us understand and appreciate what I believe ultimately is God's message, and that is His desire above all else to be in a relationship with His people. Well, as promised, we are getting closer and closer to Christmas, and we started in Genesis, and now we're slowly beginning to kind of wind down this series, and it's almost going to kind of blend into our next series as we come into this Christmas season, which is going to be a series titled Give It Away. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but as we have kind of journeyed along, we have seen how God has built a nation of people, the nation of Israel, with the desire to not only be in relationship with them, to not only bless them, but so that they would essentially become a blessing to everyone else. God's plan as laid out in the Old Testament is essentially to build a community of people that would be His representatives in the world in which they live. That ultimately God, above everything else, wants to live life with them. And His hope and His desire is that they too will choose to walk in obedience. But as we know, in any relationship, there are ups and there are downs. And this is particularly true with the people of God. Of how, in spite of God's faithfulness, in spite of God's goodness, so often they choose to live life on their own. They think they can do it better in their own way. And what we begin to see so often in the Old Testament is this nation beginning to crumble, beginning to essentially fall apart. In the last couple of weeks, we have really seen the reality of this nation being broken apart, of how at one point in time God had given them this land. God had promised them just this life lived with them, but because they chose to go their own way, they lost the land. That the city of Jerusalem, that which truly represented the place in which they were called to live, the temple was destroyed, the city wall was knocked to pieces, and Jerusalem lied in ruin. And then over a period of years, essentially the people of God were exiled and forced to essentially be assimilated into other nations. And you're left with this place of wondering what happens next. And one of the great reminders of the Bible is that even when we choose to go our own way, even when we choose to go through the guardrails, over the edge, down the cliff, and land in the ditch, God is there to meet us. God is there again to show His love and His faithfulness and His generosity to us, giving us yet another opportunity to truly live life with Him. So although Israel had gotten to the lowest of the low, God says, I want to rebuild my people again. And last week when Tim was here, he graciously followed along in the series that we were doing, and he focused on Ezra, the priest, who was the one who was so influential in the rebuilding of the temple. Again, establishing that presence of God. But as you continue to read along, you realize that there was much more work yet to be done. So I'm going to invite Heather to come up and just read into this next phase of what was happening.
This morning's scripture is taken from Nehemiah, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, and that's on page 430 of your Bible. Nehemiah prays for his people. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hilkiah, in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, one of my brothers, Hanani, came with certain men from Judea and asked them about the Jews that survived, those who had escaped that captivity, and about Jerusalem. They replied, the survivors there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned the days, fasting and praying before God of heaven. I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both I and my family have sinned. We have offended you deeply, failing to keep the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinance that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses? If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are under the farthest skies, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place at which I have chosen to establish my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great power and your strong hand, O Lord. Let your ear be attentive to the to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man at the time I was cupbearer to the king.
So this is essentially 13 years after the temple had been rebuilt. And we still see that many of the Jewish people were still living in other nations as they had been exiled by foreigners. And then Nehemiah, a follower of God, gets a report from one of his brothers wondering what is happening, what is going on in Jerusalem. Perhaps he had heard good things in sense of the temple being rebuilt, and it was his hope that there would be continued good news. But as we see from the reading this morning, the news was not good at all. Nehemiah heard that the wall had been completely destroyed and it was still lying in ruins. Now, we may look at that and think, well, what really is the big deal? I mean, why don't you continue to send more people back into Jerusalem? But we know in the ancient Middle East, it was a highly militaristic society. And a city without a wall was essentially a sitting duck. And so people would not want to return. People would not feel safe returning to Jerusalem until this wall was completely rebuilt. So Nehemiah takes it upon himself to take the first step. A small step as it may be, with the hope that it would turn into something far greater than he could even imagine. And so he goes to the king, a foreign king, and asks permission to go back to Jerusalem and begin building this wall. What I so appreciate about the Bible is the small details that it gives, that so often we can skip over and we can wonder. You see, it's important for us to understand that not anyone would be able to have an audience with the king. That the reality is that unless you were summoned by the king, you could not just simply show up, knock on your door. It's not like it was like our local MP where you could say, hey, listen, I have a grievance. I want to talk to you about something. Can you please listen to me? This was the king of the conquering nation. And he says, I want to return home and build. The detail that can't be missed is the fact that we're told that Nehemiah was the cupbearer. And what that essentially meant was he had the highest level of security clearance. He was essentially one of the right-hand men of the king. That he was the one who would essentially sample the wine and drink the food to make sure that it wasn't poisoned so the king would not die. Now, you may look at that and think, I don't know if I'd want that job. But the reality is that if the chances are you lived a pretty good life. Up until that one moment when suddenly your need was called into action and you fell over flat, you were essentially showing up to work to drink wine all day. Drink good food, live in the palace, and hang out with the king. Not too bad of a gig. And Nehemiah was willing to give all of that up. A life essentially lived in luxury, that what you perhaps would refer to as the happy life, to go and rebuild a wall. But more on that in a moment. Miraculously, Nehemiah's request is granted. The king finds favor and not only sends him with his permission, but essentially front loads him with materials and to help him get started. And so Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem to see what has happened. And the first little bit he spends kind of checking out the wall and figuring out what needs to be happening. But this was no little feat. Speaking from someone who has little experience in building anything, yet alone a fence in my backyard, I couldn't imagine what it must have been like to build a wall around an entire city. He shows up and there were significant obstacles. The stones lied in piles of rubble. The gates were burned and just ready for destruction. The people were tired. They would begin the project and suddenly they would start to lose faith and thinking, why are we doing this? What is the point? Should we continue to go on? But then there was also outside obstacles as well, opposition. You see, there was foreigners who were living there that thought Nehemiah and his crew were absolutely ridiculous, wondering why on earth would you be doing that? So they would taunt him. They would speak words of discouragement. They would essentially trash talk what Nehemiah was doing. Anyone here want to learn a little ancient Middle Eastern trash talk? Yeah, all right, good enough. I got enough of a positive response. So you're going to help me out in this, and imagine you're there and you're opposing Nehemiah, and it's essentially going to go this way. I'm going to say, your wall is so broke, and you're going to say, how broke is it? Okay, you with me on this? Enthusiasm, people. Here we go. Hey, Nehemiah, your wall is so broke. Oh, no, that's not good enough. Hey, Nehemiah, your wall is so broke that even if a fox climbed up on it, it would fall right down to the ground. Hey, I didn't make it up. Take it up with the Bible. Moving on. But then if that didn't work, they would then physically threaten the people as well. When they realized that Nehemiah could not be discouraged with simply the words they spoke, they said, we are going to come. We are going to attack you. You don't know when, you don't know where, but Nehemiah, we are coming for you. At some point, I have to think that Nehemiah thought, I gave up drinking Merlot for this? But he persevered. They then understood that they had to continue to move forward. But there were other problems as well. There was problems within the ranks. You see, one of the realities was that there was a class system. There was rich Jews and there were poor Jews. And what was happening right in Jerusalem was that the rich were taking advantage of the poor. They were essentially giving loans to the poor who as well were trying to rebuild their lives, but at such high interest rates that they could never pay back. So they would just basically swoop in, take over all of their stuff, and continue living life. The challenge for Nehemiah was that guess who was primarily bankrolling the rebuild? All the rich folk. And so Nehemiah had to confront them and say, this is not the way of God. What are you doing? And time again, we see how in spite of good intentions, obstacle after obstacle after obstacle was laid before him. And you almost wonder, would this project ever get up off the ground? Miraculously, as you continue reading, they finished the wall. Anyone know how long it took them to build the wall? Anyone? 52 days. 52 days. Any do-it-yourselfers, that's slightly disheartening, considering the fact that I've been trying to do a reno in my basement and it's taken me 52 weeks and it's still not done. They completed this wall in 52 days. Absolutely amazing. And as I take a step back, one of the greatest lessons that I learned from the life and the example of Nehemiah is his incredible consistency. That at every turn, when he first went and saw the problem, he brought it to God. When he first had to approach the king, he brought it to God. With every obstacle along the way, he continually brought it to God. And then even in the midst of their success, after the wall had finally been built, Nehemiah brings the praise back to God. We see this in Nehemiah 8, verse 10, when essentially Nehemiah has gathered all the people, along with Ezra the priest, and we see the temple has now been rebuilt, the wall has now been rebuilt, the city is now being fortified. And Nehemiah, in his grand reopening of Jerusalem's speech, essentially says, we have been able to overcome. We have been able to find success because the joy of the Lord is our strength. As I thought about that phrase that he used, I began to realize that this must have been one of those life verses for Nehemiah. This must have been one of those great realities as to how he truly lived life, finding joy in the midst of God. When you think of joy, how do you define it? What does it begin to mean for you? You see, oftentimes I find in my own mind, when I think of joy, the first place I immediately go to is a sense of happiness. And although that is helpful, and although there is a portion of happiness in joy, it's not sufficient. It doesn't truly go deep enough for us to fully appreciate what it means to be people of joy, what it means to be people who find our joy in the midst of God. You see, because happiness, by definition, is situational. That dependent upon what is happening to you, it evokes the emotional response of happiness. And that oftentimes you find yourself in a situation and something may happen and suddenly you're happy, but then if something else happens that is bad, suddenly you're no longer happy, suddenly you're sad. And I often wonder if what we want when we live life with God is simply for Him to make us happy. And it becomes problematic, because what then do we do? How is it that we then respond when we find our circumstances that do not convey the emotion of happiness? When a loved one dies, when a relationship is broken, when we become sick or ill, when a job is lost. And the list could go on and on. If our best understanding of God is that He is to make us happy, how do we respond? How do we deal with life in the midst of the reality that we all know that there are those happy moments, but then there are those real moments as well? How do we move forward? How do we respond? You see, what's interesting about joy is that joy can encompass the reality of happiness, but it is so much more. Because joy is not simply an emotion, it is a disposition. It is truly a characteristic of who we become when we follow God in the midst of all of life. The best understanding I have of joy is that confident assurance of God's love in our life, of God's presence in the midst of it all. So that when things go well, absolutely we are happy. Absolutely it evokes that emotion of just incredible happiness and joy. But when things take a right turn, it still means that we are joyful. It doesn't mean that we, as followers of Jesus, we put on that fake plastic smile and think, you know what, I am unaffected by any of this. Because we know it goes deep down. But what it does mean is that we can still be people of joy. We can still be people who move forward because we know that God is at work in the midst of our situations. I think that's why when Jesus says, I have come to give you the abundant life, It is so much more than simply, I just want to make you happy. He wants us to be people who are joyful. So the question I've wrestled with is, what is it that I am pursuing in life? Am I pursuing simply to be happy? Because as I thought about it, I thought if I simply pursue happiness in life, I become a person trying to chase a squirrel. Anyone ever chase a squirrel? My kind of person, Bruce. I love it. A couple of years ago, I worked as a landscaper. It's probably a fancy word for grass cutter. The guy owned a lot of acres, and I had to cut their grass every week. And one of the jobs was he also raised Airedale Terriers for show. And I had to walk these dogs to get them in shape. And so I would show up every morning at about 8 a.m. with my work boots on, ready to go, and I'd have these two dogs. And I guess I had a bit of a sense of humor because they says, you know what, hold on to the leashes real tight, Joel. Don't let the dogs get away. And I'm like, yeah, got it. Walking down the laneway of their house, a squirrel would dart, and that dog would go that way. A squirrel would dart, that dog would go this way. And suddenly, the dogs were now walking me. I'm sure you've all been in that situation. But what I started to realize is that when we chase simply happiness, we become like people chasing squirrels. We see one little thing over there, and we dart over there, and it seems like it's so good, but it's elusive. And then something else over there, so we dart over there. You see, happiness is something that just begins to happen in the midst of life, that if we simply try to pursue it, we spend all of our time chasing things, but failing to truly grasp it. Which is why Jesus says, come and follow me, and you will live a life of abundance. You will live a life of great joy, that I'll be present in the midst of those happy moments, but I will give you something far greater. You see, happiness is only one side of the coin. The other side is what joy begins to offer as well. And that is the reality of God at work in the midst of everything in all of life. I think what Nehemiah shows us is what a life lived seeking joy begins to look like. It enables us to overcome and deal with any situation in life. The good, the bad, the downright ugly. God says, be confident. Be assured that I am with you and I'm at work. Joy also allows us to take the attention off of ourselves. You see, if we simply want to be happy, a lot of focus will be put on how we make ourselves happy. Whereas remember Nehemiah, he was ready to give up the happy things of life in order to meet the needs of others. He was willing to leave the palace to go to the rubble because he was fueled not simply by happiness, but by the joy of the Lord. And what we begin to see is that when we are people filled with joy, people take notice. You see, our greatest witness to the reality of God at work in our life is not how we respond to success, but I believe how we respond to the difficult places, how we respond to others in great need. You see, we are people of joy when we are able to overcome through the strength of God the difficult places. We become people of joy when we are able to focus less on ourselves and more upon others. So what's our takeaway here this morning? Hopefully you got a little card with a sun on it. How many of you have started decorating for Christmas as of yet? Who are the real keeners? Awesome. Hey, full disclosure, we got our Christmas tree yesterday. They were on the lot on Friday, and Canaan was after us on Saturday to get it, so we got it. It's getting ready to be decorated. We need your help in decorating the church this year. One of the things we're going to be focusing on the next number of weeks is how in Christmas we can give it away. And next week, I promise there'll be 2 Christmas trees here that will be lacking in decorations. That is intentional, not just because Joel forgot to organize it. What I want you to do is take this card away this week and use it as a reminder, as an opportunity for you to think of the ways in which God has given you joy in the midst of life. Reflect upon the ways in which God has strengthened you in the midst of perhaps challenging times, or has fueled you in those exciting times. And then what I want you to consider doing is to find some way this week to focus upon others. That because of the joy that God has given to you, it'll enable us to focus a little bit less on ourselves and more upon the needs of those around us. And just simply write it down on the card. And then next week, there's going to be hangers here at the front of the church, either before the service or for those arriving late at the end of the service. Just hang it and put it on the tree. And we're going to decorate our Christmas trees as a reminder and as an opportunity for how we are going to serve others in the midst of Christmas. In many ways, we are being led by our kids. They've got a head start on us downstairs. They're filling up that bulletin board. We can't fill up a bulletin board here, but we're going to try to fill up a couple Christmas trees with a reminder of what God is doing in the midst of life. My hope and my prayer for you is that you will not simply pursue joy, happiness, but that you will ultimately pursue joy, which means focusing upon Jesus, focusing upon what he has done for all of us, and how we can then return that by focusing on the lives of others. If you didn't get a card, there's some still at the doors, I believe. So please stand as we sing together.